All right, friends. Today I have a bit of a different conversation perhaps for us, but something that is really timely. So I'm so grateful that our friend Douglas Kruger is up in the middle of the night. What is it, 2 a.m. for you right now?
2 a.m. and some spare change, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for rising and shining with us today. Douglas is the author of several books, including the hard-hitting new release, Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good: How to Identify, Debunk, and Dismantle Dangerous Ideas. Douglas's previous books have focused on topics like wealth and poverty and how different belief systems contribute to each other. He hosts a YouTube channel dedicated to debunking terrible ideas, which is called Breaking Woke. And I am so grateful to hold this space with you and have this on our show here today.
It's a great pleasure, and do forgive me if I'm a little tired and slower-witted than usual. If you see me struggling with a word like cat or dog when what I meant to say was U.S. constituency, then please just forgive me. It's the lack of sleep.
No, it's
But great
remarkable
pleasure
that
to be with you.
you're willing to, be up at literally 2 a.m. So I'll give you an easy question, I hope, to start to get things warmed up here. And that is just what inspired you? You know, you have multiple books around poverty, wealth, entrepreneurship. And I'm just curious what inspired you to take this path to kind of pursue entrepreneurship for yourself.
Yes, the story behind the first book is very much the kind of theme of thinking that led into the new book on political correctness, which was I wanted to write the book that I wish someone had given to me when I was in my early 20s. There are so many things you have to figure out the long, hard, slow, stupid way. And it's the sort of thought processes that are in some cases very obvious and in some cases a bit more subtle and nuanced, that you actually need someone with a bit of experience to take you under their arm and say, try it this way, don't go that way, here's the thinking underpinning it. And the first book of that nature was titled, perhaps somewhat combatively, Is Your Thinking Keeping You Poor? And it's subtly different from what you might call a sort of a typical get-rich-quick book. In fact, it looks at the opposite. It says, what holds people in these generational cycles of poverty? And what is within their ability to bring to bear on the situation in order to get out? And my own reason for writing this is I kind of straddle two worlds in a strange way. I grew up in an area that was relatively well off, but as the odd kid out. And I often I say whenever I speak on this that it's the little things that give you away. Like we have the British school system where you would wear a blazer to school. And your first day of school, the blazer is too long because it has to be. And then 3 years later, the blazer is up here somewhere because it's the same blazer and you've
Grow
started
into it.
growing. Yeah. So that was my reality. And I went to the school that was relatively well off, sort of middle to upper class bracket and income bracket. And it was just this dawning consciousness as a very young kid that there are different worlds and different sets of answers, and we seem to be stuck in one but watching the other one. And that was the genesis of asking these questions. What are the differences in thinking? And that led me to 20 years worth of trying to unravel those answers, which became the book. And in the process of doing that, I discovered that there are two sets of answers to many problems, both to the problem of wealth and in many senses to the problems of life. There are the politically correct ones, the easy, comforting ones that we are often told. And then, unfortunately, there are the true ones. And very regularly, the two have nothing in common. So
Yeah.
that really was the kind of genesis of thinking about it for me.
Wow. A couple of things in there that really stand out to me that I hear from a lot of entrepreneurs is that there's something that happens in our childhood that spurs our path, right? So for me personally, like I wasn't the girl with the lemonade stand, like selling baseball cards. Like I didn't have that like entrepreneur vision for myself. All I knew is that I wanted to do something different. And I'm hearing that you had maybe that kind of sense as well from a young age.
Yeah.
And then asking great questions is what leads you to figure out, what you are when you grow up, right?
Yes.
And what you're saying, or what I'm hearing, is that you asked good enough questions to challenge conventional wisdom. the things that
Yes.
we're told, that we're just expected to do. And I think that's true of everyone who, blazes a trail or does something outside of the box or starts their own business. So I can relate to that a lot. And we are in very different contexts. Okay. I grew up in small town Wisconsin. You grew up in Johannesburg. But some of these questions, I'm curious, what were those things that you started questioning that have led you to this book?
Yes, well, the first thing was quite an emotional one. When I was about 12 years old, I had my baby sister was born, and there's now obviously this 12-year age gap between us. And we went through one of the roughest periods of our lives at about the time that she was an infant going on sort of 1 year of age. And there was something that was very poignant to me, and it almost became the thing against which you rebel, the thing that drives you, almost a horrifying image of what you don't want, which was at the time we went through some rough times, and our local church supported my family with food baskets. And it's a strange mix of emotions, because on the one hand, you're a little embarrassed that someone has to help your family, and on the other hand, you're very grateful that someone is actually doing so. And one of the things that they would regularly bring around within these gift baskets was a small box of baby formula for my younger sister. And I can just remember looking at this little box of baby formula and feeling vulnerable. You'd go to bed at night and kind of worry about your place in the universe and think
Mm,
everything about this, it's not okay. So
mm,
it doesn't start off as any kind of an intellectual pursuit. It starts off as something deeply personal, something that hurts a little, and you say, what's going on here?
mhm,
After that, you start to seek out the answers. And I think if you've been through something a little harder in life, you're perhaps more willing to hear the difficult answers and to ask the difficult questions. There's maybe a necessary element of courage to asking questions like this, because it's easier not to. When it comes to anything to do with, say, politically correct answers or the nice version of reality, it is much easier just to go with the flow. So sometimes it does take a little bit of hurt, a little bit of brokenness to make you face reality and say, what is really going on here and what actually works?
mm,
Then beyond that, you've got to have the courage to hear the answers, because many of them are not nice.
mm,
And I'll give
mhm.
you just an example from my context, and I suspect this is very similar from what I view from the outside in the United States as well.
Yeah.
Many of our discussions here around wealth and escaping poverty, and we have a massive poverty rate in this country. We're a strange balance of first world and very impoverished communities. The discussion always seems to start with the words government should. Now,
Mhm.
a couple of the things that I've written, and in fact, a book coming out next year, gets quite hardcore on this, that says, stop right there.
Yeah.
Government should nothing. Government is largely the problem. And there's a lot of sort of sound economic thinking behind that in terms of why starting the discussion with government should is exactly the wrong way to go. So it does require thinking against the grain. It does require originality. But not all of it is as bleak as I make it sound. A lot of these answers that we then discover are wonderfully freeing truths that you can do things with.
Personal responsibility, right? And
100%, yeah.
I think
And that's it in a nutshell.
right, right. And, one of my mentors, Jack Canfield, who wrote the Success Principles, this is success principle number one through and through,
Yeah.
that when you take 100% responsibility for everything in your life, I'm talking even the weather, the election, like we are all choosing to get wrapped up in the conversation or to live in a place that has crappy weather. Like
Yeah.
you're not a tree, you can get up and move, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And this is so hard to hear, like you said, because I don't think it's necessarily natural, but we have been socialized to look outward for everything, for
Mm-hmm.
validation, for how to eat, for what's right and what's wrong. We are so, and we don't go to look at ourselves to be the blame when really it's
Yeah.
all our fault. Everything is all our fault. And
Absolutely.
that's what
That accountability is just so important. I mean, it's the foundation, it's the heart and soul of everything.
absolutely. And I think that what we're seeing right now, and I know you wrote a book about business and coronavirus as well, is that
Yeah.
people who are waiting for the government to buy them out or tell them what to
Yeah.
do, they haven't done much in the last 9 months. Where, Douglas, how many books have you written in
Oh my
quarantine?
gosh, I've lost count. I
Seriously though,
actually, yeah, I had a
but
strange
finding the
confluence of
opportunity,
things.
finding
Yes,
the
absolutely.
opportunity and not waiting for the government or a virus or a vaccine to come and save the day. It's
Yes,
not
for
easy.
sure. And in fact, just touching on some of the sort of the core ideas in that book and how they relate to accountability, I mean, it's exactly what you're saying. The folks that I've seen really prosper through this period and use the time wisely have done several things. The first one is they've asked, what is within our control right now? Certainly, a lot of things are off the table. We had quite strenuous lockdowns in which, for example, certain industries just died an absolute death. But the question then became, all right, if you can't do that, what can you do? Can you speak to your customers in different ways? Can you serve the same people with something else? Can
Mm-hmm.
you separate out the point of sale from the point of delivery? Because those time periods can actually be divorced from one another, and that can be enough to get you through. But possibly one of the most clever things that people have been doing is to position themselves for success on the far side.
Yeah.
To say, all right, everything is up for grabs right now, but the human needs underpinning whatever it was you did as a business have not mysteriously disappeared overnight. In most cases, they're simply on hold. So what could you do to position yourself as that strong brand, that top name, that leading expert in this time? If you have say, a retail business, for example, could you buy out your competitors, which then makes you the logical choice at the end of it? If you are an individual, could you be producing some kind of useful thought content that positions you as that name on the far side? And all of these things really come back down to exactly what you're saying, which is, are you taking accountability? What can you do?
Yeah. Amazing. And like you said, this applies to business, this applies to relationships, right? The same mindset of what can I do? I think that's a
Yeah.
really great question. And speaking of great questions for people listening, another way I think about this is just to frame a situation in a what if brainstorm. Okay, so we
Yes.
know what you can or can't do maybe, but like you're saying, what if we bought out competitors? What
Yeah.
if we shifted our brand messaging? That what if sentence stem has been so helpful for me, especially in these last few
Absolutely.
months.
Yes, and what it does is it actually takes you out of the noise in your own head. It gives you a framework by which to look at a mess and just to think about it differently. And there are a couple of great books on this one. One that springs to mind, I can't recall the author's name, is titled A More Beautiful Question. That's a very good one. Edward de Bono, the guy who does lateral thinking, has got some great books on that as well. And just some very clever, very simple ways of zooming back from your problem and asking different questions about it in order to see different things. And it's amazing how powerful that can be. You know, you don't even need the technique so much as just the willingness to try it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're warmed up. I gave you some easy questions, right? I want to talk specifically about this idea of political correctness
Yeah.
and what you mean by that, because you have a very polarizing book title, right?
Yeah.
Political correctness does more harm than good. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so let's start off, because we've been speaking economically and with wealth and poverty. Let's start there. Although the book touches on everything, it goes into identity politics, it goes into all the great flavors of the day. But starting just from an economic point of view, here you have two sets of answers. You have what you will typically hear from politicians, which is kindly sounding social programs about helping the poor. Then you have this bizarre disconnect that people tend not to examine. And we tend not to examine it because of election cycles that go either 4 years or 5 years, depending on what happens in your country. A politician will stand up and say very kindly things about what should be done. It is difficult to argue against that because in doing so, you position yourself as unkind to the poor. So it is packaged in such a way that it is hard to argue with. If you then trace the results, you discover that it actually ends up doing more harm than good. There's a great example of this one, a book I recently came across called The Tyranny of Experts. And the title is a little misleading. It makes it sound like the author is attacking all experts. In fact, he's not. He has been involved in government social upliftment programs across Africa and in developing nations for some 40, 50 years. And at the end of all of this, his take on it is, we're not doing any good. And in fact, if we'd done nothing, the outcome would have been better. Now, here's what he comes down to, and it's a little philosophical in nature, but it's really quite interesting. In the United States, which remains the world's most prosperous nation and has been for a very long time, your opening idea is the freedom of the individual under law. So, I mean, if you go all the way back to your constitution, it starts with the inviolable individual. These rights are held to be to universal. And then basically you're allowed to build a state around that insofar as the government doesn't impede on that inviolability of the individual. Now, what happens in these African nations is you will have generally a very Marxist economist will consult to these governments and say, don't worry about the human rights stuff. We can skip that step. Just start with a big program for economic upliftment. Now, of course, what they're missing there is that the economic prosperity follows from freedom. You can't do it the other way around. So in a best case scenario, what you actually need is a stable, well-governed, and relatively boring nation that is not trying to do social programs and government programs and economic programs. In essence, the government says, here's your safety, and then gets out of the way. And the reason for that is that all wealth comes from the point of sale. If you have a business selling something to another business, an individual selling something to another individual, that's where wealth is generated. The sort of economic advisors to these countries essentially skip that step. They start with wealth exists, now how do we distribute it? You've already missed a step. And the critical question there is, how is it developed in the first place? That's what we need to be asking.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, simply put, what I'm hearing is that there's a difference in mindset between, again, it's, to me, I'm hearing like employee mindset versus entrepreneur mindset, right? Employee, again, goes back to like, someone else will take care of it. If I'm just loyal and like stay here, then I'll be taken care of. They're going to,
which is the opposite of the mindset that you were speaking about earlier, which is asking questions, having courage, and having that sort of that bold idea for your own life. It is much easier not to.
Yeah, you're right. It sounds great, right? Like on paper, this is like, yeah, I should do my own thing. I shouldn't wait on someone else, right?
It is much harder. And of course, here's where it starts getting scary. Here's the up and the downside to it. The upside to it is that the stats today show that the majority of the world's millionaires and billionaires living today are first generation business owners. Now that first generation part, of course, is important because it's saying they did not inherit it. It was not passed on down to them. These are men and women who have started their own businesses or have become the leader of a business. And almost all of the world's millionaires and billionaires today fit that category. The exceptions are a very small number of people who have inherited and corrupt business leaders or rather corrupt government leaders. That's a category as well. So in terms of genuinely growing a great deal of wealth, absolutely owning your own business is the way to do it. The scary part, of course, would be the stats on how many people fail when they try. Now, I counter that with the idea that if you try 10 different businesses over your life and one of them succeeds, that'll do. Yeah.
All right. So I always like to put these things into practice, right? Like you mentioned, this is philosophical in some ways.
Yeah.
And, you know, the subtitle leads me to believe, and some of the other work leads me to believe that you have a plan in place here, right? To actually help us identify bad ideas and, you know, create better ones. So
yes,
for folks listening, how do we embody what you're talking about?
Okay, so the very first thing that I point out is that most politically correct thinking tends to be very emotional in nature. And unfortunately, and this is why it's so hard to dismantle and to debunk, it tends to hide behind this language of kindness.
Yeah.
And it uses terminology that implies that it is obviously doing the right thing. So the starting point is very much what US commentator Ben Shapiro talks about when he says, you know, facts don't care about your feelings. And it's this notion that if you go searching for the truth, it might not be what the kindly sounding narrative has been sort of presented. So
Can you give us an example? Like what would be a narrative or a kind philosophy that we're just blindly accepting or need to challenge?
All right, I'll give you a very challenging one, and this is possibly one of the sort of most challenging topics of the day, is the issue of children and transgenderism. Okay. Now, this is one where we have seen 3- and 4-year-olds their parents taking them through this transitioning idea, flooding their bodies with hormones, taking them for surgical changes and so forth. And this is all, of course, done prior to puberty, which, of course, makes it more effective. Now, we know so very little medically about what is actually going on here, but a few things that we do know are quite concerning. One, for example, is that over 90% of young children who tell their parents, who believe that they have this issue, that they believe they are the opposite gender to what they were born with, grow out of it if left to do so. So it becomes the case then that you have this kindness narrative that says, well, we're helping these people, we are sort of freeing them, we're doing the right thing for them. However, had you not done so, by itself over time, the stats suggest that it would have changed all by itself. So you then have to look at the children who have gone through this process and say, how many of them statistically would not have gone this route if they had been allowed to live a little longer? And as I say, that's one of the much more challenging topics. But there again, you can see this difference between the scientific understanding, what we actually know about it, versus the kindness narrative. What really becomes a problem is when the kindness narrative becomes so overwhelming that it's an idea you're not allowed to talk about, that even asking the question is considered morally unacceptable. And that is political correctness. And that's the part that worries me. I use the phrase in the book, you can have political correctness or you can have the truth, but you can't have both. And I think that's one example of the problem of that dynamic, where it becomes so difficult to even ask valid questions. And yeah, that's diving into one of the most contentious topics of the lot, but it's a good microcosm of the idea.
Yeah, absolutely. This might be a tangent. I'm going to throw this out there though. I'm curious how you see this sort of, I don't have the right word for it, but this focus on facts more than feelings. Are you familiar with like the cancel culture that we're seeing in the US right now?
Yes, very much so. And it's also a part of the new book. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then maybe I'll let you take it from there, because what I'm hearing, that there are certain sets of facts that we need to get honest about. But when we look at an individual and facts, in politics right now, and maybe one set of facts ruling someone out, right? Like canceling. If you do one thing wrong as a politician, then I'm not listening to anything else you say.
Yes.
How do you talk about that in the book?
Well, that's very interesting, because it's actually exactly the same thing that we touched on briefly with the economic discussion, which is I made the point that what you ultimately want is rule of law and freedom. And what you don't want is a politician sharing grand social visions. And one of the reasons for that is that a grand social vision that employs people impedes on freedom. If you are being used as a pawn for a political vision, to a degree, you are not free. In a nation in which people are genuinely free, there is no imposed big thing that is being done, because that's the opposite of personal liberty. Now, that's the massive scale version. That's the political version. Right down to the interpersonal version, where you jump onto Twitter and people shut you down, tell you you're not allowed to say this. That's the small version, which is the thou shalt nots and the thou shalts. Now, one of those is, both are a problem, but one is actually strangely more of a problem than the other. The thou shalt nots, which is very common, people saying you're not allowed to say that and shutting you down, cancel culture, deplatforming, that is a very common part of human interaction. In soft ways, there is something useful about it. We tend to shun bad behaviors. And when it's done in small groups and interpersonally, usually the function there is to stop people from being rude. It's an upholding of basic good manners. What's new to our species is you're trying to say something and 6 million people responding and shutting you down. Now that's something that is, even from the perspective of how our brains cope with other people, that is new and very unwelcome. It is also not even as bad as the thou shalts. The thou shalts are worse. Jordan Peterson from Canada, who's I think quite well known in the United States, rose to prominence for his refusal to use gender pronouns. And his argument was that it's not even about gender. It's the idea of someone telling you what you must say. And that's a whole different ballgame. you must raise your fist. You must use this terminology, thou shalt. There's something very concerning about that, because at the most simple level, if you have to do a thing that a mob requires of you, you do not have personal liberty. It's also very anti-free freedom of conscience. If you are a thinking individual, if you are a reasoning individual, the idea that you must raise your fist when the mob tells you to should be foreign and repulsive.
Yeah, so let's go there. How do we forage better ideas or better actions than following the status quo?
Yes. Well, the very first thing is we need to have tolerance for discussion both ways. And I'll give you an example of this one. I was quite pleased to see this. I'm well aware that this topic of debunking political correctness is a very contentious one. And it really does sort of split politics in two. I mean, it really is. It's kind of, I'm standing on what you might call either the conservative or libertarian or classical liberal side, and I'm throwing stones at the radical left. It's as simple as that. Now, I submitted an article on this to a group called Mensa in the United Kingdom for their consideration. And Mensa is a group called the High IQ Society. So these are some fairly bright people, but they love to argue. And the editor wrote back and said, I strongly disagree with everything you're saying, but I'm going to publish your article. and that's fantastic. So
Yeah.
it's this openness and ability to disagree and to say, but it's okay to disagree. And I think what matters greatly there is our willingness to open up our ideas and belief systems to scrutiny. I mean, for example, I'm a Christian, and I don't hold that to be a topic that people are not allowed to debate or attack. Now, by attack, I don't mean violence with a mob. But I do mean in terms of words and ideas and serious questions. And what I get at in this book on political correctness is truth must prevail. And that counts for my faith, it counts for scientific ideas, it counts for social ideas. The worst thing you can do is say, there is no debate to be had here. We forbid a debate here. And that's what's happening with things like the transgender argument and things of that nature, where it is simply, you may not speak about this. I'll go one worse for you. I've been keeping an eye on what's happening in the UK. South African culture, in certain respects, follows British culture in many sort of appreciable ways. And right at the moment, they have a bill being proposed by the Scottish Parliament. And the bill is packaged as an anti-hate and anti-discrimination bill. So once again, it sounds kind. It sounds like obviously the right thing to do. How could you possibly be against an anti-hate bill? But what the bill would allow is if you speak unfavorably about a topic like Islam in the privacy of your own home, you can be arrested for that. Now, that is a very new concept to a nation like Britain that has long been a place where people are free under the rule of law. This notion that if you speak unfavorably about an ideology, you can be arrested and taken out of your own home. That's the opposite of what we should be after. That is very sinister and incredibly dangerous.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of circles back to the cancel culture topic, where we are creating these cultures of saying nothing is better than speaking up or asking a question or challenging norms. It sounds like, this is being put into practice in other countries. We just watched something recently about, countries in the UK having mandatory lunches at school, which is a great thing, but they're giving pork. And so people who have beliefs against pork, then those kids don't eat. And it's like, again, racism or constraints or things can be put in these kind packages at the macro level of leadership and politics, but also on the micro level of don't say anything political on your Facebook page, don't do this, don't just those things that hold people back,
and we police ourselves in that way. Yeah. And in fact, something that most people are not aware of, the very first use of the term political correctness, it's not a Western invention. It comes to us from Soviet Russia. So, I mean, it is directly from the communist government of the time. Scholars trace the earliest use of the phrase politically correct to the year, it's somewhere between 1921 and 1922. And it was used on purpose in a communist government propaganda piece and disseminate it as a way in which to control the population. The basic idea is you cannot police every single human being yourself as the ruling tyranny. But if you can teach people to do it interpersonally, that's job done. So you teach them to be afraid of one another. You teach them which topics they may not speak about and so forth. We have some strange things coming out of that one. I mean, at the fall of the Soviet Union, people from places like Poland were uniquely able to fool lie detector tests because they had spent so much time under that kind of pressure. Yeah, this don't let people know what you're thinking. If you're asked, give the desired appropriate response and so forth. And I mean, what an unnatural way to live. And also just what an anti-scientific way to live. The best ideas should prevail, and that's messy. And it requires that we be able to put our egos aside, debate the living daylights out of things, argue with one another, and then go and have a beer afterwards. I mean, that's what we're after.
Yeah. And to add in one last layer on this before we hopefully put this in a nice gift package for people, what we're seeing in the US right now with a very tense election. Okay, we're recording this Thursday, November 5th, 2020. We still know who
everybody's looking at Nevada and going, dude, what are you doing?
Yeah, like we were not meant to spend this much energy on Pennsylvania and Nevada, but we're doing it.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing is just like polarization and so many right versus wrong. And we're dealing with this whole like fake news. So what I'm hearing from you, Douglas, is like we need to get back to facts and have healthy debate, and then move forward and not decide whoever wins this or that or what we call whatever is right or wrong. Because there's always room for debate. Like even when we bring it down to real facts, there are people's perspectives and opinions, and we just have to be okay with that and quit saying someone is going to be right. Like
and I think you've also hit the nail on the head there with this idea of the facts mattering. So you can look at this from the perspective of the fake news phenomenon and how much of a problem that is. And a sort of a parallel concern to that one is the sort of retelling of history. Ideas where we go and look for statues to pull down and so forth. And I know that's been one for you guys as well. I remember watching on Sky News a few years ago when the Taliban pulled down these 2,000-year-old Buddha statues. Now, I am not a member of the Buddhist faith, but I look at that and I go, that's part of human history. 2,000-year-old monuments carved into a stone wall, and there they are being torn down and blown up in the whole trip. And I think we make a great mistake when we look back on history and try to morally preside over it and say this history is good and that history is bad. I'll give you an example of that one from my own nation. We are going through this exercise at the moment of which monuments do we pull down. And the one that's sort of most under attack at the moment is one from a gentleman named Cecil John Rhodes, who is an English colonialist and a bizarre figure. And that's, of course, where the problem comes in. You go, well, from where we are with today's woke modern viewpoint, we look back and we judge that. Now he must go. And you go, well, let's take a different example. There is Shaka Zulu was a famous warrior chief in South Africa. He was also an absolute nutcase. I'll give you a practical example of this one. When his mother died, he brought together several hundred pregnant women, and he had them killed in front of him and had the babies torn out in order to try to understand how life works. Now, let's stop there and say, can we say that this is a morally problematic person? I think the answer is yes. Now ask me, should we tear down his statue? No. It's part of history. This is a terrible man, a great man, a significant man. This is history, and we learn from it. We don't try to impose our visions of what the past is or should have been. We look at it warts and all, and we tell the truth. Of course, the great project at the moment is to try to look at American history and paint it as this dark, racist slavery, that it was sort of founded in shame. And I go, that's not an accurate picture. It's a narrative. It has the warts and all, but tell the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So much here. And, one of the questions I always ask at the end of a podcast episode here is, what would you say to someone listening who's hearing all of this and is like, wow, like there's a lot to do. I definitely need to check myself before I wreck myself, maybe.
Yeah.
But I do want to bring this to like the ground level of what is one thing listeners can do today to help them get to a more true future, or what I would call, a dream life, a utopia,
Yes.
if you will. What
Okay,
are
I'll give you a few ideas on this. The first one comes from a man named Douglas Murray, a British author who wrote The Madness of Crowds. And he points out that in a best case scenario, when it comes to all the political debate and the left and right and so forth, what we actually want is to get on with our own lives. And the reason that he says that is, if your whole sense of yourself is invested in one side or the other, your entire life is going to be the cycle of wins and losses, and you will never find something that is deeply gratifying to you. It's almost like your happiness depends on what's going on the outside. And he says many of the battles are worth fighting, but it cannot be who you are. You've got to have other interests. Go read a good book. Go fall in love. Go have an adventure. To become Hobbit-like. Walk out of your door and see where your feet take you. And the other one is
I want to just comment on
myself
that.
as well.
I want to comment on that one really quickly, because like we've been saying throughout this call or this conversation, is that it's not always easy to do that or to be seen as the person doing that. So timely, because of all the election weirdness and whatever, I was like, we just need a change of scenery. We're going to go to San Francisco and go to the beach for 24 hours. And I posted on Instagram, and it's like polarizing that we went to the beach and had a great time and the rest of the world is anxious. And it's like, it's just as much energy to be worried as it does to be joyful. And like, we got to keep living our life.
Absolutely. And I think the way that I try to take that on board is that, the way we're built as human beings, if 99 people give you comments and one person says something disapproving about you, which one are you going to go to bed thinking about? And when you know that, and when you know that it's true for everyone, you can, to a degree, compensate and mitigate against it. You simply have to tell yourself, social media hatred is not real. It's a storm of words, in most cases with very little in the way of consequence. And it is hard at first to extricate yourself from being so deeply invested in that. And I think especially for young people, there's a lot of research that's quite troubling about how self-harm and suicide are dramatically up among young people who get deeply involved in social media, and that the link is quite strong. And it's at that age, you don't have the experience, the wisdom, the maturity to be able to say, this actually doesn't matter. And even if my whole class is shouting at me over Twitter or over whatever forum, it's not real. And I think sometimes it takes an older person to point that out, and to say to the younger person, I know you don't get this right now, but it's okay. It doesn't matter.
Okay. Amazing. I think, like having your peace, having healthy debate, and then, also having hobbies and the rest of your life, and, kind of getting out of again, I think it goes back to this, like you're good or you're bad, no matter how you do it. So that's super helpful. And I think there's a lot here for folks to digest. I think you gave some really great concrete things that we can start shifting our perspective on, right? Asking better questions, looking more critically at facts versus feelings, so that we can be more, I guess politically correct isn't the right word, but at some point, we can become more correct, perhaps.
Yeah.
So, Douglas, I would love for you to tell folks where they can, purchase the book and continue this conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. And you mentioned the virus-proof one. If you are struggling with your business, with lockdowns and so forth, it's a very short book. It's been published all around the world, Virus-Proof Your Small Business. Now, I'd love to hold up the new PC one, but I don't have it, which is quite bizarre. So it was published in the United States, and my copy hasn't arrived yet.
Oh my God.
It's available all over the world, though. Easiest starting point is just to jump onto Amazon.com. And the title is Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. It's available as an ebook. It's available as a paperback. And I have read the audio version of the book to date, but it hasn't been released yet. So that's coming as well. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Did you read it in your voice, the audio?
Yes, I did. And I tried to sound as deep and intelligent as I possibly could.
No, I've enjoyed listening. This is such a great radio voice that you have.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much. I think I've got a bit of an echo around me in the kitchen here, but the audio recording doesn't. That was done in a proper studio setup.
Amazing. And I made sure that that Amazon link is here on the live stream, as well as in the show notes that we'll be sharing out soon. So Douglas,
I
thank you
really
again
appreciate that.
so much for startling your morning in the middle of the night with us today. Really, really powerful conversations. And I do hope that listeners continue this line of thought through the book or your YouTube channel. And we'll wrap it up there, but definitely appreciate you. Thank you again. And listeners, I'll be back next week with another inspiring guest that will help you make your dream life your real life.